Welcome to a breaking news edition of the All Hornets podcast network. Charles Lee is your new head coach for the Charlotte Hornets, signing a 4-year deal, coming just hours after Rick Schnall teased at his golfing day at the Wells Fargo Championship. That announcement was coming very soon. He was not lying. And live to give us some reaction just minutes after the announcement is Jack Simone of Celtics Blog and How About Them Celtics podcast, a beat reporter for the Boston Celtics, and he is coming to give us some of his thoughts of what he has seen being around Charles Lee this past year in Boston, seen some of the players, interacting with him. So, and Jack, and people probably won't know, we used to be co-writers at the Hive back in the SB Nation days, and in COVID lockdown, that was also something we were doing as well. So you've gone on to good things, which I'm glad to see. But Jack, how's it going?
I appreciate that. I'm good, James. Thank you for having me on the show. At the Hive, shout out at the Hive, man. That was the first writing gig that I got. I was looking for a chance, and at the Hive gave it to me. So shout out. And yeah, Charles Lee has been great this year. To put it in perspective of how much even Celtics fans. I had one of our podcast listeners DM me today, and the announcement of Charles Lee being named the Hornets head coach came out, and he said, "We're cooked," as in we're done for. And then the announcement came out that he would finish the playoff run with the Celtics, and he was like, "Never mind, we're back." And so people are big fans of Charles Lee in Boston, needless to say.
And let's talk a little bit about Charles Lee's path to Boston, right? He's the associate head coach this year, and he was brought to kind of give Joe Mazzulla, who had, I think, I've seen from the outside, and time wrong, a bit of a shaky first year in charge, and he was obviously thrown into the situation a little bit with Will Hardy, ended up going to Utah, and it landed on him. Why is it that Boston seek to bring Charles Lee in, and what do you think he really gave and is currently giving the team this year?
Yeah, I mean, just the way that Joe Mazzulla had to take over in Boston was completely out of the ordinary. Ime Udoka gets let go or suspended right before training camp, and Joe Mazzulla is just kind of thrown into the fire, into a situation he wasn't anticipating at all. So he didn't really have a chance to get ready or build his philosophies into the team. It was just kind of, all right, go figure it out on the fly with a team that's expected to win a championship, which it was unfair to him. And I think he got a lot of unnecessary hate. I think it was a very imperfect first season, obviously. I mean, if you asked me to start a job that I wasn't prepared for with a week's notice, I probably wouldn't do very well either. And so this summer, or this past summer, I should say, was all about giving Mazzulla a chance to not only implement his coaching ideals into the Celtics, but bring in people to help him in having him build out his own staff, because he was also working with a staff that was tailored to Ime Udoka. And so he was able to bring in Charles Lee, bring in Sam Cassell, bring in a bunch of others guys that he could work closely with. And I mean, just bringing in talent that knew what it took to win at the highest level, I think was very valuable to Mazzulla, who again was very new to this. I think he's the youngest head coach in the NBA, maybe second youngest. I think Will Hardy's also up there, who was ironically on that Celtic staff with Ime Udoka a couple of years ago as well. So I think it was all about bringing in experienced assistant coaches, and Charles Lee was up for head coaching jobs for a few years there before joining the Celtics assistant coaching staff. So I think it was just a perfect match there in terms of both what Mazzulla needed to help him succeed at the highest level and what the Celtics needed to help accomplish their goal of trying to win a title, I guess, still at this point.
And for Boston specifically, did Lee have a focus? Was he the guy responsible for the defense, for the offense? Were there any particular players who he kind of worked with in terms of skill development, or with him being associate head coach, was he actually almost like a level up from being a skill development guy? What was his kind of specific role in Boston this past year?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. He worked closely with Drew Holiday again. There were a lot of reports and indications that he helped Drew Holiday get acclimated to Boston because of their previous relationship from Milwaukee as well. You see him in practice working with Tatum, with Brown. He worked with a lot of the top guys in terms of just development during practices and drills and stuff like that. There's a quote from Joe earlier in the season, and it was, quote, "He brought that level of perspective with the drop defense that he had and his ability to teach it and coach it. It was good having him and good having a bunch of guys from different places who bring those different perspectives." We know the Bucks like to run that drop defense with Brook Lopez, and you've kind of seen a big version of it from the Celtics in the playoffs this year. They run switch everything except the 5. So if the Al Horford or Porzingis or Cornette's in the action, they'll drop back and they'll depend on Derek White or Drew Holiday or Peyton Pritchard to play trailing defense and contest the 3 from behind that way. But if it is a wing or a guard, they'll switch everything. So it's kind of a version of that, and it's worked out pretty well. Unless the Heat decide to make every single 3 on the planet, then it probably doesn't work as well. But other than that, I think he's focused on the defense a little bit and working with the top players. But I think he's just been overall like one of the top guys, one of Mazzulla's right-hand men next to Sam Cassell. So he's done a good blend of everything, I would say.
And I mean, you'll have probably maybe interviewed Charles Lee, you'll have seen him speaking to various parts of the media, interacting with players, being around the team. If you were to describe his personality to someone who didn't know him, what type of person is Charles Lee?
Yeah, so the assistant coaches haven't really talked to the media as much this year, but just watching him work with players, watching him on the sidelines, like talking to coaches, he's just kind of like a happy guy. Like he's just kind of like a good dude. You've seen him bring his family a couple times to TD Garden, and seeing him interact in that sort of aspect briefly was fun. He's obviously intense isn't like is a word you can use to describe him, because he's very serious about his job. But I think just the way he goes about his business is very professional, but you can also tell at the same time, like, yeah, this is just like a guy that players could get along with easily. Like he just feels like a good overall players coach, while simultaneously being like very strong, like having very strong beliefs in his coaching philosophy. So I think it's a good blend of like personability with sticking to what he believes in and teaching it at a very high level, which I think is kind of what you want in a head coach. So it's shocking that he hasn't been a head coach yet. So I think this is really good for Charlotte that they snagged him now.
Yeah, and you have, like, say, have to walk that fine line, right, between being like likable, but also garnering the respect and being able to hold guys accountable. That's the line I think every coach is probably trying to find. So that's interesting to hear. I'm curious, going from assistant to a head coach, there's 100 examples where it's worked. There's 100 examples where it didn't. There is no like this will or won't work. It's always to be seen. What I am curious about, and feel free here to say no. You don't need to lead our listeners on, right? Can you see how he conducted himself with players and with staff? Do you get the feel of kind of like that senior leadership feel from him over the course of this year from observing him? Or really, like, did he just kind of appear like another assistant in terms of what he was doing? Again, this is a leading question. I know what everyone wants you to say, but I want you to be honest about what you kind of viewed.
I think Boston created an environment in which everyone was very equal. Like Joe Mazzulla has preached this mentality of we're all working towards the same goal. Like, and this isn't even just the coaches. It was like Svi Mykhailiuk is just as important as Jason Tatum. Everybody on this team will do everything that we need to do. I mean, I didn't even like say Svi because he was a Hornet last year. I just kind of brought up a name at the end of the bench, but shout out Svi Mykhailiuk. He has sort of developed this. We're all working towards the same goal. The bench guys are just as important as the starters. We need these guys to be just as ready as everybody else. And so I think that's kind of how they treated everything, but just the way they interacted and the way that Charles Lee interacted with the team, the way he worked with the top players. Like there's a quote from earlier this year from Charles Lee, or excuse me, from Drew Holiday on Charles Lee, saying having Charles here is obviously a familiar face. Also having Blaine Miller, who was in Milwaukee for a while and is now the main Celtics head coach, has really helped me. Charles has always been the type of guy to be very teacher-esque. If you have any questions or anything like that, I could always go to him, but he's also quizzing me on plays and schemes, what to do defensively. He'll just walk up to me and ask a question about something, and I have to answer it. So it's always keeping my mind going, my mind engaged. And so it just feels like he was always one of the guys willing to not challenge players in the sense of like Tom Thibodeau challenge them, but challenge them in the sense of like keep them on their toes, keep them ready, keep them understanding what the goal is, knowing the schemes, knowing what the plays are, just at all times, like keeping players engaged. And so from that perspective, yes, like he was very clearly like one of the top guys, one of the guys at the top of the coaching food chain. But I think Joe Mazzulla has worked really hard to create an environment where everyone is on the same playing field, the same level. And so it might not be as obvious as other environments. That's not to say that Charles is incapable of it, because he's very capable.
And you talked about the mention of the main Celtics coach there. What we sometimes see happening when coaches are appointed is they end up bringing some of their former colleagues with them. Some guys can get promotions. Is there anyone that you think, like just from a connection standpoint, that you immediately think could maybe come with Charles Lee to Charlotte? Again, would be after the Boston season, but either from Maine or from Boston. Are there any names that really stand out to you?
Yeah, Blaine Miller is definitely one. He was the main Celtics head coach this year, and he worked with Charles in Milwaukee as well.
Okay.
There are other guys. I'm not sure how deep his connections go on the team, but I do know he went to Bucknell, and I know DJ McClay on the Celtics staff also went there. He has been a Celtics guy, so I don't know if that is a like connection Charles Lee to DJ McClay, but I know they both went to Bucknell, so that is maybe another guy to look out for. And he's great. He works with the big men a lot, and he's awesome. Outside of that, I'm
No, but those are two good
unsure.
names. Those are two really
Yeah,
good names, which I think Hornets fans can keep an eye out
keep an eye
for
on.
as he tries to build out the staff. Like I say, because of the nature of where Boston are in, competing for titles and where Charlotte are, I imagine you're not going to get people doing sideways moves, right? Stepping from assistant to Boston, assistant to Charlotte. It's probably going to be, well, am I getting a step up in responsibility? What am I adding to my
Mm,
CV? And that's what it kind of looks like there. So the one that you mentioned, the main Celtics head coach, is definitely a name. And also interesting because Chase, also someone who my normal co-host,
yeah,
currently works for PR for the main Celtics
he
and
does.
knows the Celtics head coach quite well.
Yeah,
So very interesting worlds colliding here between the Celtics and Hornets. And this Hornets Celtics link goes on, right? Terry Rozier, Gordon Hayward. We finally move off them. But as you move off them, you bring in Grant Williams, another former Celtics player. And
I
now
love
you bring
Grant
in
Williams.
you bring in Charles Lee, who coached against Grant Williams in that Milwaukee Bucks Boston series when
Mhm,
Grant Williams was like the defensive guy against Giannis and did a pretty good job, really. But
mhm.
at that time, Charles Lee was on the Milwaukee side, not the Boston side. So he will have seen exactly what Grant Williams can do defensively and what that role is. But the links between, for as good as the Boston have been, as bad as Charlotte has been, I feel like the amount of former Celtics people who've been in Charlotte, this should have gone better, right? Boston always seemed to dump everyone at the perfect time, and Charlotte seemed to pick them up at the worst time. I'm hoping that ends here with the appointment of Charles Lee.
Yeah, I love Grant Williams, by the way. He was my guy in Boston. I found myself defending him in that last season he spent here. But yeah, Charles Lee just seems like built to be a head coach, almost like primed, ready, should have been a head coach years ago. And for a Hornets team that is very ready to like take that next step and make the playoffs, barring any unfortunate injury luck again, like he seems like a perfect guy to help lead them into that next step in their development process.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know some people will be listening here. I mean, I've basically let Jack speak this episode because this is what we're here for, right? People want to hear, your input from someone being on the ground. I mean, from my point of view, Charles Lee was the candidate I identified even before Steve Clifford mentioned that he was stepping down. I always thought Budenholzer was kind of out of reach. He's another obvious name. But Charles Lee has just got the perfect blend. Like for anyone who hasn't been a head coach before, you're probably not going to get a better CV than Charles Lee. I mean, all time, he's a 64% winning percentage as an assistant over his 10 seasons with the Hawks, Bucks, and Celtics. They've been top 10 offenses and defenses, all of his teams. I think 4 or 5, about 50% of the season. So he is not someone who just focuses kind of like on one side of the ball. He seems to, like you said, find that balance of doing both, which I know sometimes fans find it, well, was he a defensive coach or an offensive coach? Believe it or not, you can be good at both. Like, not everyone always has to come up with kind of being on one side of it. And at just 38 years of age, the Hornets have got a very, very young roster and a very young core. Guys like LaMelo Ball, Mark Williams, Brandon Miller. I think they had a lot of respect, actually, for Steve Clifford. I think he was very popular. Equally, I think he will be able to understand guys just in a different way and be able to have conversations and establish relationships, which are probably maybe like less of like the father figure that I think Steve Clifford kind of went for, and more of like that kind of respectful peer. So I'm a big fan of the hire. I'm looking forward to seeing Charles Lee in post. Obviously, hoping that he has a good season now with Boston to kind of further gain some more experience. Equally, if they did flame out sooner he's in the building for the Charlotte Hornets. So you might have some Hornets fans a little bit torn now about how well they want Boston to go for.
We'll see how long he lasts. No, I think Charles Lee, especially defensively, like the offense is there too. Like you said, you can absolutely be good at both. But like for Mark Williams, even to get some of that drop defense and some of that play style, like I think he's going to benefit a lot from this coaching hire in particular. I think the coaching staff Charles Lee builds out is going to be really interesting to watch unfold as well. I think Blaine will probably be on there. I just think this is the perfect guy. I always like seeing young teams get young head coaches that they can kind of build together with. Like I really like the match here with Charlotte and Charles Lee, and that's not just me saying it because you invited me on your podcast, I promise.
Yep.
Which I appreciate very much.
Yeah, it's this. I've said this online. This is my favorite appointment the Charlotte Hornets have made as a head coach. Like in the moment, we all kind of knew this was coming. I never bought the JJ Redick stuff. I kind of said it out loud that I didn't think it was real. It wasn't. It was very clear that this got decided in the last couple of days, and it was interesting. I thought originally that the decision had been made almost like 3-4 weeks ago and was waiting till after the playoffs. The messages I've received after this kind of suggest that maybe that wasn't quite the case, that they identified Charles Lee as the guy maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, but there's been negotiations around contract, around staff, around budget. And I think that is what has maybe taken some time to confirm. And if you remember, flashback to last hiring cycle, that Kenny Atkinson got hired before that had been agreed. And that's where things started to break down. So I think the fact that Charlotte were able to keep this quiet until everything was signed, sealed, and delivered is a extremely positive progression. I mean, it's what a normal, respectable franchise should do, but they've not been a normal, respectable franchise. They've not operated like that. So just getting to that like base level, I'm taking that as a big win, and the way that they've gone about it. So I think it's been a good process here. And yeah, I don't have anything more to add right now. I'm looking forward to getting his introductory press conference whenever Boston win this NBA championship. Let's hope.
Hey, I'm in for that as well. I appreciate the vote of confidence there. I'm excited to see what Charles Lee can do with that Hornets roster. A Hornets roster that is just so ready to make a playoff push, especially in an Eastern Conference that looks, we'll call it shaky at best. So I think they've got a good chance with Charles in charge.
Well, Jack, there is nothing else from me. Anything else you want to get off your chest before we get out of here?
I don't think so. I think that's it. I'm pumped for Charlotte. I still hold a little place in my heart for my time at the Hive, hoping the best for them. It's like my secondary team in the East. So I'm very, very excited for Charles Lee to take over there.
All right. Jack Simone of Celtics Blog and How About Them Celtics podcast. Thank you very much for coming on the All Hornets podcast. And we will hopefully speak to you again in the near future.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me.